A lot of times organizations can go ahead and just do a boilerplate policy. For example, sexual harassment. You can do what I like to call a thou shalt not, and then you just list all of the things that you're not permitted to do. But workplace violence prevention plans, in order to comply with California's law, are not so simple. Yes, there's specifics laid out within the law itself, as well as there are current revisions that are undergoing review. But there's a lot more required by the state of California than simple thou shalt not policies. So in this piece, we're going to look at why creating a workplace violence prevention plan is very different and why your organization should not use a boilerplate approach to this. Hey, I'm Mike Corwin, and I spent 30 years investigating violence, both in the workplace as well as for litigation purposes. I've seen how violence occurs, and more importantly, how violence can be prevented. If you'd like to set up a free strategy call to discuss your workplace violence prevention program and to make sure that you are complying with California law, just click on the link in the description below. We'll set up a call and go through your program. And if it looks like your program's solid, I'll tell you. If it looks like there's some things that you could do or should do differently, I'll let you know that too. The first reason why workplace violence prevention is very different under California's workplace violence prevention law is the assessment process. Within that process, you have to examine where are the safety hazards for your employees. You might think to yourself, well, there's 4 source types of workplace violence. It doesn't really work that way because your employees need to look at what they're doing day in and day out and where those safety hazards come from those 4 different source types of workplace violence. Now, for example, the most common source is what I like to call invitee violence, which are the people that come to your business or work with your employees as part of your course and scope of business. So for example, if you're a law firm, you have clients that come to the office, or your staff goes out and meets clients or goes out and meets with witnesses. That is a source type known as type 2 or invitee violence. And so you have to do an assessment of how that type of violence can affect you. So for example, if we look at meeting with a client at your law firm, let's say you're doing the meeting in the conference room. First, you look at where will the safety risks come from that client. Let's say the client is angry and feels like you're not doing enough. Maybe the client has some mental health issues. Can be any of those type of things. So if you're inviting that client or that witness into your office and you meet in the conference room, you really need to look at why this person might be a safety risk and how that risk might manifest itself. That's where the assessment comes in. And the very best way to do those types of assessments actually come from interviewing your staff and looking at your practices and saying, okay, where are we at risk? So for example, one of the easiest ways for someone to be injured in workplace violence when dealing with an invitee is to be trapped by that invitee to where you can't gain access to an exit. If you're stuck in there and that person has control of your ability to leave, that puts you at serious harm. And you might want to then look at how do we actually do this type of client meeting, this type of witness interview. And based upon that, the second part of the assessment isn't just identifying the safety hazards, but it's also developing corrections for those safety hazards. It's not enough to say we have a risk from a client. You've got to look at where that risk comes from and what steps you can take to eliminate that risk, or at least to minimize that risk, and then what steps you need to do to actually implement that. So it's really a 3-part process. The next reason that creating a workplace violence prevention program is so much more difficult than, say, a sex harassment program, and why you can't just do a boilerplate thou shalt not, is because of the way that violence happens. Look, violence is not linear, okay? It doesn't start at point A and work its way to point Z. Violence can occur at any point within that continuum. Sometimes it occurs with warning. Sometimes you might have a chance to de-escalate, but oftentimes that violence starts immediately with an attack without prior warning. And if you think about it from the attacker's perspective, a sneak attack is going to make you most vulnerable. When you're looking at your workplace violence prevention plan and your implementation, making it a program, you have to look at the way violence actually occurs. And this is no offense to those that put together those boilerplate policies, but unless they're experienced with violence, they're not going to be able to tell you how to address those different scenarios. One of the things that California requires, and this goes directly to that last point, is what are called strategies to avoid physical harm. Now, you talk to most people who put out these policies, these plans, and say, here, you can buy this workplace violence prevention plan from us. The problem with that is because they don't know violence, they don't know the strategies that work, because the number one strategy they always talk about is de-escalation. Some folks call it verbal jujitsu, but you know what? Most attacks occur without warning, with zero chance to de-escalate. So you can't just look at a generic approach and say, we can, put this in, we'll put this in, we'll put this in, because that's not the way violence works. You have to have an understanding of how a violent attack occurs so that you can identify and implement through training the appropriate strategies to avoid physical harm. And you have to help your employees to make sure that they understand which strategies work in which circumstances. As I mentioned, you can't say, let's de-escalate on a sudden attack, because it simply won't work. But you can, let's say, implement situational awareness so that you can recognize that someone is becoming a threat. Or maybe if you think there's a chance to de-escalate and you want to make sure, you can teach them how to read body language that will tell them if they have a chance to de-escalate or if they just better prepare to be attacked. Now again, one of the areas, and California is very strong on this, within their strategies to avoid physical harm, by California law, your employees can engage in self-defense or in defense of others as long as it's proportional. And you as an employer can't say, well, I don't want my employees doing that because it could cost me a lawsuit or it could raise my insurance premium. Because California law says absolutely not. You may not retaliate, you may not prohibit the acts of self-defense or defense of others, so you might as well embrace those and make sure that your employees understand how to do so safely, and most importantly, when to do so. One of the areas where workplace violence prevention under California law is going to be very different, and why it doesn't translate to a generic program, is you need to assess your physical environment, both the exterior and the interior. You need to look at lighting, you need to look for obstructions, you need to look at the parking lot, you need to look at how do you get from point A to point B, both in the interior and the exterior. You need to look at your front reception area. You need to even look at where the restrooms are in case members of the public or your invitees will actually use those locations. And you need to assess how that plays out in terms of safety. Sometimes it would be about making an interim place where someone can hide, but oftentimes it's about where there's an obstruction or where there's not enough light. So for example, if you have a mechanical system that's located outdoors and it's accessible to the public, then someone could actually hide behind that equipment and then use that to launch an attack. You have to look at where cars are parked. Can a person be laying in wait in the parking lot of your business waiting for one of your employees who that person was personally involved with to come out, and then can conceal themselves behind a vehicle or behind a pillar so that they can then launch their attack. And by the way, when you talk about your 4 source types of workplace violence, one of the ones that people tend to forget is that violence can and does occur caused by people that were personally involved with your employees, that they themselves have nothing to do with your company, but because they were personally involved with that employee, maybe it's a domestic violence, maybe it's a drug-seeking relative who's looking for money. Any of those types of things can lead to violence. So as you put together a plan, you need to actually get a sense of how that could interplay with your employees. And as you implement strategies to avoid physical harm, what approaches will be most effective to help your employees avoid that type of safety hazard. An additional way in which workplace violence prevention as mandated by California law is very different from sexual harassment and other employment types of policies is that you must do certain things each and every year. It's not just updating a policy. It's not just doing simple trainings. You have to go through and do the assessments again. You have to look at what works, what isn't working. You have to look at procedures that you can change or alter in order to eliminate a safety hazard. And then you need to train your employees in those new procedures. This can be a real challenge if you haven't had a violent incident to use as data. But you still need to do that assessment, look at the policies, discuss with your employees, and make sure that you are doing things the best way. And if not, California requires you to do this each and every year to update your approach, to implement that new strategy, and to train your employees in that new strategy. One more area where workplace violence prevention under California law is very different from, let's say, for example, a sexual harassment policy, is that by California law, your employees must really drive the purpose. Now, California says that you have to have effective ways where your employees can be engaged in the process, from everything from identifying safety hazards to remedying safety hazards to the types of training that they feel will help them keep safer. In sexual harassment, you say, "Thou shalt not" from the top, HR enforces it, and you're done. Does not work that way with workplace violence. So you need to come up with an approach to actively engage with your employees, and that again starts with the assessment, but it works at each different step, because it's not enough to identify a risk. You have to figure out approaches to remedy that risk, and then you have to implement those approaches. And that involves training, it involves working on different procedures, and all of those under California law require your employees to be actively involved in that. Now, these are just a few of the simple ways that a generic workplace violence prevention program is not going to work for you. If you'd like to know if you're on track with your current approach to workplace violence, particularly because by the end of 2026, Cal-OSHA will be enforcing this law, schedule a free strategy call with me, and we'll look over your plan, and if it's good to go, I'll let you know. If it can use some help, I'll point out the areas where you can work on improving them. Just click on the link in the description below.